the number is increasing, so we can wait just a minute or so. Okay, welcome to the Cannabis Plant Science and Cultivation webinar for October. We will begin shortly and would like to allow a brief moment for attendees to join the webinar. I still see the number is increasing. Once the number is stabilized, I can get started. But again, let's wait for another 30 seconds. Hello, everyone. I'm Sang Park, a senior scientist and the chair of the ICR Cannabis Plant Science and Cultivation webinar series. I extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us for our October webinar. This webinar series is co-hosted by Dr. Nili Bernstein of the Volcani Institute in Israel. We have the privilege of featuring renowned professors in the field of cannabis. We hope that these distinguished speakers will provide you with excellent insight into the science of cannabis plants and cultivation. Please consider sharing this webinar with your colleagues and do not hesitate to nominate potential speakers for future sessions. Today's presentation will last approximately 40 minutes and will be followed by a short question and answer period. To ask a question, please utilize the Q&A feature in the Zoom toolbar. For any technical issues or general questions, please use the chat function. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to today's moderator and co-host, Nirit.
Hi, thank you, Sang. And thank you, Professor Whipker, for joining us today in order to tell us about your research on cannabis. Brian Whipker has been a professor at North Carolina State University for over 30 years, specializing in plant nutrition, plant growth regulators, and diagnostic of disorders. He has published more than 120 scientific papers and over 300 grower articles during his career. He also co-created an online grower resource, very powerful one, I should say, which focuses on nutrient monitoring and nutrient standards. He also co-authored the book Nutrient Deficiencies in Bedding Plants, a pictorial guide for the identification and correction, which I highly recommend you to look at. The culmination of his plant growth regulator research is emphasized in the Plant Growth Regulator Guide for Annuals, which was published by Fine America GrowerTalks. His current focus is to provide science-based grower information about plant leaf tissue analysis standards and plant nutrition. And again, Professor Whipker, I really want to thank you for joining us today, and I'll be very happy, very much looking forward to hear you talk about the topic of cannabis insights, diagnosing nutrient disorders. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. So like it was said, I work a lot with plant diagnostics because the position I have is research and extension. So I have to problem solve with growers. So, you know, with floriculture, there's like 1,000 species. So cannabis just ended up being 1,001. So because I like diagnostics, I probably like dead plants better than live plants, but anyway, at least that's what I want to get a photo of. And you know, when you're at a grower's location and you see a problem plant, when they see I get excited, they know not to be excited because it's a great photo opportunity that you can photograph, find out what's going on, and then share that information. So today I'm going to take the approach of trying to do a holistic approach on diagnostics. And so it includes some of the research that we've done to add into it and kind of maybe help you if you're having some problems with your own crop from growing it, or you're helping other growers that's dealing with the situation, help them diagnose the problem that's going on. So let's get started. So the first want to thank the team that has been working on most of the research. Many of them have graduated. Only one still the student that's working here. Others have gone on. For instance, Paul Coxon on the upper left, doing his PhD at University of Kentucky. In a lot of the work that was done or being presented here is the work that he did when he was involved as a master's student here at NC State. So we have published some of this information in guides because I have an extension appointment doing outreach in publications geared towards growers is important. So the QR code is there. The QR code will be the last slide also if you want to get access to these PDFs, and it includes fertility recommendations, leaf tissue analysis, water quality, and then also if you're growing in containers, the pour through nutrient monitoring technique. So we published those about 2 years ago with eGrow. So when you're looking at plants, hopefully everything's going well, but sometimes things go bad. And so that's what the focus kind of is on this presentation, when things are going not as expected. So going to cover first the diagnostic process. So if you have a problem, how do you need to look at it to try to help you figure out what's going on? It may not give you the answer, but a lot of this is an 80-20 to point you in one direction or another to help you down that path to figure out what's happening. And then we're going to look at some of the key nutrient disorders that we see with cannabis production. So starting with the diagnostic process, you have to keep in mind that, as a plant nutritionist, I think in one silo, an entomologist thinks in a silo, a pathologist, a physiologist. But when you're in a grower situation, you have to have a grasp of everything, a holistic approach. And knowing what the insect disease, physiological, and nutritional disorders are helps you figure out what's happening. And you also need to be aware that more than one could be happening at the same time to try to figure it out. A classic case we had with petunias, there were aphids, there was iron deficiency, and there was powdery mildew on the same plant. So it was a triple problem at one point. So again, you got to think in a systematic approach to trying to go through and diagnose problems with the system. To get started, there's really a quick and dirty method that works. And some of the people up at the University of New Hampshire talked about this about 20 years ago, and I adapted it for what we're doing here. And so how did the problem happen? That's the question you want. What went on? How did it occur? And so you need to know what happened, i.e. the pattern. You need to know where it happened, the distribution of that pattern, and then when it happened, the timing. Those three questions get you a long way down the process of figuring out what is going on, or at least brings you up to what tests you might need to end up doing to help decide what the problem is with your plant. So let's start with the pattern. So what kind of pattern are we looking at? You see the classical symptomology there: interveinal chlorosis, yellowing between the leaves, more overall chlorosis, necrotic spotting, and this regular spotting that's going on, describing what's happening to help you know what you're looking at with the plant. And here's a very nice way of looking at trying to diagnose a problem, and that is, what's the pattern on the leaf? If you folded that leaf over, is it a mirror image or not? That's the question you need to ask. So to illustrate that, I drew the line. So is the pattern the same on both sides of that line? Well, clearly the one on the left is not, and the one on the right is. And so that helps you decide the big factor. Is it living? Is it biotic or abiotic? It makes the fork in the road for the diagnostic process. Now, when you're doing this, you got to take it on leaves that are just starting to show the symptoms, because anyone who's grown cannabis and run into powdery mildew, in about 2 weeks that leaf on the left is going to be totally white, and so you're going to say the pattern's the same on both sides. So you got to go earlier in the process of the problem that's inflicting the plant. So that little test helps tell you, is it a disease insect or is it a nutritional physiological problem? And that the 80-20 rule, there's always exceptions, but it gets you a long way down the process. The other thing that matters is location. And so is the problem the flowers, stems, leaves, or the bottom root and crowns? Why is this important when it comes to plant nutrition? Because location is about, that's what you use to help diagnose the problem. Is it in the young leaves? Is it in the lower leaves? Is it in both? And why that's important goes back to how nutrients move in the plant, especially when there's a deficiency. If it's an immobile where it won't move, you're going to see the symptomology at the top. That's going to be an iron, a calcium, a boron deficiency. Older leaves, where the nutrients are mobile, if the plant has the shortage, it will bring those nutrients from the bottom and translocate them to the top. And that's why you see nitrogen deficiency, for instance, at the bottom foliage. And then we have some partially mobile ones that are kind of the oddballs, and we'll cover that in a second. And so when you look at nutrients problems that occur in the young and the old leaves, which ones are they? So primarily the ones on the left on the bottom, nitrogen is probably problem number one. Sometimes you have phosphorus deficiency. In our location, because we're not over limestone bedrock, we don't have magnesium in the water supply. And if you don't add it, it's not there. We run into magnesium problems. And then high overdoses of high fertility, boron, any of the micronutrient toxicities will also cause burn on the lower foliage. At the top, there's a number of problems there too, but the biggest ones you see on most plants, including cannabis, is a calcium boron, and numero uno is an iron deficiency, usually induced because of high pH problem. And then the middle ground, you got sulfur and you got molybdenum. It'd be an oddity to get a molybdenum deficiency, but I'm sure it can be done. Sulfur, you'll see it, especially if you're not providing it via Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate in your fertility regime. And for us in North Carolina, our water is pretty pure. So again, if you don't add it, it's not there. You might run into a problem with that situation. So then let's look at the distribution of the problems. Where are the symptoms, i.e. in the bed or in the greenhouse or in the field that you're seeing it? If it's scattered plants, it points you in one direction, being non-uniform. When it first starts to develop, not after it's gone crazy, but when it's first developed, you're looking at a biotic problem. A disease outbreak starts usually at one section and spreads, insect spread over time. Now, late in the season or after a few weeks, of course, it might be all the way through the greenhouse. And another exception is that, like a virus disease that comes out of your cuttings from the stock plant, if it's all the mother stock has the virus, of course, the distribution is going to be over all the plants. So it doesn't hold. Again, 80-20, 80-20 that goes on with that. So here's a scattered plant that went down. You look at the root system and it obviously has pythium going on, but it's one plant in the row. So it really points to a disease issue that's happening with the plant. But if the distribution is all at the one end of the bed or the entire greenhouse, you're looking at very uniform situations, and then you start thinking of non-living factors, a mechanical problem, a physical problem, or chemical. And so physiological disorders, nutritional overdoses, herbicide burn, things like that can occur. So those patterns tend to be kind of complete in the greenhouse, or at least a portion of what's going on for similar cultivars or plants under the same regime of growing. So you can see it here, the example, these are cuttings. The entire lot has lower leaf yellowing due to nitrogen deficiency. And so again, an abiotic disorder that's going on. And then another important factor is what's the timing that happened on the plant? Did it come quick or did it gradually appear? So good growers are going to be looking at the crop. They're going to see what's happening and see that something's going on, and they should know the timing. When you're looking at quickness, it really gets down to only a few things. spray phytotoxicity, you sprayed 2 days ago, you see it. Water stress, oh, the drip emitters stopped up on that particular plant and the other ones aren't. So it's a very quick process that goes on. And so gradual ones, to get a cyclamen damage like that takes weeks. It might take 6 weeks. Soil nematodes on the left or right, that's a slow process for them to grow and populate. So it's going to come over time. And so from this list here, the value is what comes fast. If yesterday it was good and today it looks bad, that really points you down to only a few things, and really a chemical phytotoxicity, which is a herbicide drifts the same, air pollution, environmental stress, temperatures, nutritional toxicity. The list pinpoints you down in one direction to figure it out. Anything that's moderate or gradual is still open up, so it doesn't help you on pinpointing as nicely as the fast ones. And I don't have it in here, but if you're talking to a diagnostician, they want to know what percentage of the plants are affected. That does go down to the distribution, because if it's 80% of the plants, I'm thinking one direction when I'm problem solving for a grower versus if it's only 2 or 3. So all those things come together to help out on the process. So it is a set of key questions of the pattern, the distribution, the timing to figure out what's going on. Now, as cannabis, at least for North Carolina, has been a relatively new crop and people had to learn it. And I think around the US that has been a new learning experience for many of us. But knowing what the common problems are, like 80% of what commonly happens gets you pretty far. Experience does help, because you see this, you relate it to that. And then all those things come together, and it's a high value crop. Any crop in the greenhouse is high value. Guesses might not be worth much. So test to confirm what you think the diagnosis is. And so then you are smarter for knowing if it does appear again, what actually is there. You need to, as one professor in the US would always say, if there's something going on, show me the data. You need the data to back it up. And so then you have confidence of what you're seeing, and you're fixing it or giving the recommendation to a grower that you're working with. So we're going to shift now into looking at some of the common nutrient disorders that we see with cannabis. And so we're looking at fertility issues, substrate issues, and water quality. And so we're looking at the fert, dirt, and squirt that's going on. Those will cover 80% of the problems that you commonly see with cannabis. And so let's start with water quality, because that is one of the inputs that starts everything out. So it's the biggest input. You need to know what you're adding. And so it's important that what is being supplied and what isn't being supplied. In the classical case here in North Carolina, because we're not over limestone bedrock, we don't get calcium and we don't get magnesium supplied. We have to add it. And so, but if you're in the middle part of the US, or the Great Plains or the Prairies provinces, you're looking at being over that limestone. You'll get that, plus you get the added benefit of alkalinity that you have to fight, and probably elevated pH. But you'll have to fight your pH problem, or at least remedy it in those locations. So and then you get into arid areas that the water quality can vary. Is there other micronutrients that are toxic? So you need to test to know what's there and what isn't on there. So here's some overview parameters, and we talk about that also in those production guides, that for the most part you want low levels of NP and K in your water supply at the get-go from the pure water. If it's higher, you're talking about contaminants, especially in the Great Plains, the Corn Belt. Elevated nitrates are not good for human consumption. So you just need to know what's in there. And if there are elevated levels, you might want to see where the contaminant's from. You could live with it if it's not drinking water. And then, like I said, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, is it in your water or not? If it's not, you need to add it. And then making sure your micros are not too high, and you'll have to adjust your fertility if you need to. If it's only marginally high, you might have a fertilizer mix without micros. It's common to have no boron added on some fertilizer mixes. And then you're looking at pH. Ideally, the pH to be around 6, but while that's important, it's the alkalinity that drives the change in a pot. And so under 100 part per million bicarbonates would be ideal, and the electrical conductivity less than half a millisiemens. If you start getting electrical conductivity higher than 1, you have some root hindrance, especially on rooting occurring. And then finally, the sodium and chloride levels. You can have a little, but if it's too high, you're probably going to have to look at remedies to fix that and remove it because of the detrimental effect on plant growth. So lab test it for management. If you're using city water, at least in North America, you can contact the local water your source, and you can ask for a copy of the water test report. Now, mind you, they might have different wells that pull from, so you might ask them if they're kind of universal, if they're all in the valley, for instance, that they pull from the same source. I dealt with a problem earlier in the year. It was from southeast Wyoming. It was right by the corner, and the person was up out of the river valley of the North Platte River, and so North Platte River water was okay, but they had astronomical sodium levels because they weren't taking it from the aquifer, and so that makes some difference. And the same thing goes around the Great Lakes. Alkalinities underneath, or limestones underneath the bedrock, so you have high alkalinity. But I got caught once that the operation was pulling water out of the Great Lake, which is surface water. So it was like the first 6 kilometers, the water was coming from the lake, and then you started getting into high alkalinity problems. So you kind of have to know what's going on. So it's too much to go. I mean, every person's water is different, so hopefully you get good water recommendations of how to manage it. The University of Florida had a water quality site, and it's still up, that you could use for evaluating water quality if you need to do that. The environmental hort, Paul Fisher's lab, did some excellent work on that. So we did talk about what's in your water, and also alkalinity control, and 2 issues of the Cannabis Business Times magazines that you can get. They're still archived there online. The search engine's a little weird. If you search by my last name, they'll come up, but if you search by nutrition, they're not always keyworded that way. So there's some 2 nice grower resources that are available. So now I want to shift to the dirt part, substrate selection. So when you look at it, your substrate's a unique blend. So at least, unless you're doing it hydroponically, there's a blend of components there to help you grow. And depending on how what's in there, it kind of modifies how you go about growing your plants. So the biggest thing is for a substrate the commercial people have done, does it have sufficient water holding capacity? Is there a pre-plant charge? Is the pH balanced? Because something like peat is acidic, but core is around neutral. And so depending on what the components are, they have gone through and got, they've dialed in the custom limestone rates to overcome some of those problems. So we've done some substrate trials in the last few years on cannabis. So here's a shot of one of them that we did a few years ago. And so what I want to share here is, now, mind you, these are retail mixes, all but number 6, I might add. They're all retail mixes, and these had pre-plant charges in them. So the idea is you pot it up and you grow, and you don't fertilize. And you can see the nutrient levels that are in there. For instance, number 3, the amount of nitrogen in there is astronomical at 561. Anything that's red is pretty darn high. And so, but if you look at number 6, everything's low. Why is that? Well, number 6 was a commercial mix, and they only add a small pre-plant charge and expect you then to add the fertility. And so the other ones don't. So it is apples and oranges that you're looking at here, but just be aware, did you buy an apple or did you buy an orange? That's the point I'm trying to make. You need to know what's in your substrate to be able to grow. And then here's the other nutrients. I mean, number 4 has 506 part per million of calcium. Magnesium's high. So things are all over the place of the charges that are there. And so you can also see the micronutrients, for the most part, other than one not having some, they're pretty well okay on the micronutrients that are there. And then there's some higher chlorides that are going on with some of the mixes that are there. So what we found on some of these retail mixes that were pre-plant charged, especially the ones with the higher EC, is that we had the tendency to get girdling going on. It was just too hot. In grower terms, they were fried. So you girdle it right off at the soil line, and that plant is dead. And but once we got out of that initial shock on a few plants with that substrate, the plants did start growing pretty well. But there were losses that occurred because it was pretty hot. Here's an overview after a few weeks of those particular 7 substrates. Now, what do you see there? All but number 6 are nice and green. Well, the point is that the substrate was made to give the charge fertility for the entire season. So numbers 1, everything except for 6 is performing like they wanted. Is 6 bad? No, that's the one without the pre-plant charge, kind of like a check. So it's growing it this way is not working. So you have to customize your growing that's going on. We did a second experiment on retail mixes. There were more of them. I only have data for 11. The only reason I didn't throw the last 3 on there was because the slide would have been too small. There's nothing extraordinary different about the last 3 that I'm hiding. But the point here is when you look at detectable levels for heavy metals, for chromium, nickel, and I can't see the last column because of the slides, how it's set up. You can see if it's red, it's above the detectable level based on the level that is there in the blue top of the column. So some of them had some heavy metals that were in excess of what you would consider detectable in those mixes. So again, what is in there you need to know. So here's those mixes in the second trial, looking at them after 3 weeks of growth. Those that had the fertility in them, of course, are big and green. Those without are not. And you can see the same thing 2 weeks later. Now, you noticed I circled the one towards the bottom right-hand side. So, of course, that plant and the one on the top of that column are not performing very well. But that's because they're designed to have fertility added to them, not a pre-plant mix. And you also see with the yellowing going on, even some of the pre-plant charged ones are running out of juice. They're running out of fertility because you see that there's nitrogen deficiency going on. But I want to point out the one I circled, that one there. You look at this next slide. Now the pot sizes are different. It's the same substrate. What's the difference? We fertilized it with 150 part per million, and we got the plant on the left. Without fertilization, you get the plant on the right. But it was designed that you were going to add fertility. So I'm not saying any of the poor growth plants in the prior slides are bad. They just weren't designed to be grown that way. And so again, you can grow in a lot of different substrates. A lot of them work well, but you got to know what you have and then be able to grow with them, because if they're too tight, they hold too much moisture, you probably have to bump the fertility up a little to compensate for irrigating less often. If they're more of a dry situation, you probably have to bump the fertility down because you're irrigating more often. So you have to learn to grow. It's the art of growing with the substrate that you're using. And so, and then if you're going to make a change, make it gradual, not all at once, because that's a pretty steep growing curve that you would have. So I just threw this slide in too, that we've done some organic fertilizer. So it has a nice component of feed in there. The nitrate nitrogen is low. That shouldn't be an alarm, because they didn't report, or we didn't measure urea or ammoniacal nitrogen, and that's what most of the form was at. So it was adequate levels of fertility to give the plant what it would need with that fertilizer source. So also know what your fertilizer source has for supplying nutrients to your plant. So when you're looking at substrates, they've been studied, and when they introduce them onto the market, they should perform pretty well, because they want to sell you a product and not have a mistake. But you must learn to grow to that substrate's characteristics to be able to be successful. And if you're going to do a trial, like I said, do a bench, so because it's water management issues, and try something else new before you convert over to a totally different substrate that you might not know how to operate. So it's trying to avoid the school of hard knocks is what it comes down to, and have less pain. So, and then test the substrates. You can send it to commercial labs to know what the chemical analysis is. Ideally, if it's a new one with lime, its own in it, I put it in a bag, like a quart Ziploc bag, wet it up slightly that it just has enough moisture, because you need about 4 days for that lime to react to get a representative pH sample. By the time it gets to the lab, they won't hold it for you. So you need to do that up front before you send it out. So then I want to shift to the other problem that we're looking at now, more with fertility, is pH. So it's a soil, it's a nutrient issue together. For the most part, from what I've observed, that elevated substrate pH, iron deficiency, does occur with cannabis, but you got to work pretty hard to get there. Most likely it's because of over irrigation and lack of iron uptake. And so if the substrate's going to go up, usually it's because you're over limestone bedrock and you have alkalinity being added that elevates the substrate pH. So ideally, and there we go, sorry, it decided to bomb on me, and let it start back up. So when you're looking at the substrate pH, initially a few years ago, there was a number of different recommendations out there that went from high to low, and so that the ranges that were recommended were pretty wide. And so for the most part, 6 to 6.5, but I've seen here in North Carolina crops grown with a pH of 4.5 and also a pH of 7. And so if the pH is too low, you're really worried about micronutrient toxicity, a buildup that goes on that you see in a lot of other crops. And so because they're more readily available, usually calcium and magnesium you're adding in the fertilizer supply, and you don't run into a problem like you might see in the field conditions. And so we did an experiment looking at pH, growing it at 3, the plant on the left, versus 6, and then we had some other ranges. But you can see that overall, what we saw was smaller plants. We did not see the accumulation of micronutrients or micronutrient toxicity of iron and manganese are the two primary elements occurring. Now, in later studies and we haven't published the results, you can get an accumulation of those nutrients, but it's because you added too many of those micros, not because the pH is low. And so cannabis is tolerant. Well, I should say it's not an accumulator of iron and manganese on its own if the pH is too low. That's what I need to call it. So here's just the shot of the substrate. You can see if there's not top growth, you need to ask if there's bottom growth. You can see at pH 3, we lacked root development, and root development started to be hindered at pH 7. So if you have pH concerns, do a test. You can do a tissue test then to help confirm what's going on. And flowable lime or hydrated lime are the common procedures used to correct that procedure problem. When you look at the pH being too high, primarily phosphorus is less available, but it's the micronutrients, specifically iron is probably the biggest one, that is problematic when the pH is too high. Some of the other ones will at times come in, but it's a rarity when you look across the board in greenhouse production. And so what you see is the classical interveinal chlorosis, very advanced for the plant on the left, developing on the plant on the right. And so it takes a lot to get iron chlorosis on a cannabis plant, at least in our experience here. So you need to explore why that is occurring, if that's happening in your crop. And this slide illustrates the point, and I know it's not a new variety of cannabis, but it shows the point that if you have a lone dog, a plant out there by itself, remember that rule of distribution. If it's one plant, you got to start looking to see whether or not it's a biotic problem. And then if you don't have roots, you have overwatering, or you have root rot, you do not have the ability to pick up iron. And so therefore, yes, that plant has iron chlorosis, no doubt about it. But why? Because it has Pythium root rot. It has no roots to take it up. So again, it pointed to a disease because it was one plant out by itself. So you got to look at why it's occurring when you're looking at iron chlorosis of the plant. So again, testing and IR to confirm it. And then I've talked about low temperatures, wet growing, root rot needs to be looked at to make sure that's not the problem. Versus the pH being too high, or you're not applying enough iron to the plants. And so a chelated iron works very well, around 4 ounces per 100 gallons of water is a standard procedure. And so our recommendations to be safe, we kind of try to do it like bumper cars between two bumps, driving down the road. You can live with 5.5 to 6.5. Ideally, I would shoot between 5.8 and 6.2. And then if it starts getting the margin, you start tweaking with the system to try to bring it back in to get the growth to be where it needs to be. So you're managing it along the way proactively for that plant. We talked about optimal pH in Cannabis Business Times in 2019. So the article's up there. And we also talk about it in the guides that we published. We also at dirtandsquirt.com have a corrective poster that talks about how to correct low pH, high pH, low EC, high EC situations. If you're interested in that, it's a free download that you can look at. The same recommendations that work for floriculture work for cannabis in a soil-based system. So let's switch to the biggest nutrient problem that we see, and that is low fertility, primarily because the element that's provided in the largest quantity is nitrogen. We're really seeing a nitrogen deficiency occurring. You see that classical lower leaf yellowing, a solid yellowing of the lower leaves, and that's a nitrogen problem that occurs with the plant. There was an article in Cannabis Business Times back in June, and Jim Faust talked on this program last month about flushing. And so we just did a little show and tell. And so we basically finished with no fertility. The plant on the left had 150 part per million nitrogen the entire life cycle. The one on the right was 0 nutrition for 3 weeks. Now, we did not leach out everything. We just rode down the curve. And you can see how catastrophic that effect is, because the plant's still putting on mass. And so you had nutrient relocation going on. And so while cannabinoids are measured in like milligrams per gram of material, you would have less expansion occurring. So then therefore the concentration would be higher in potentially higher in those leaves. And I think Dr. Bernstein's research clearly showed that on the curves that she presented on her research on nutrient levels. The overall yield is down because you don't have as many buds going on. So I mean, I'm against going to 0. I think I can't show you the data because I don't have the data. How we do it in poinsettia is to write it out with a terminal bud, like you're looking at cannabis, is that you just the mass is less, you just lower the fertility down, and what you're trying to do is keep that expansion of that flower bud mass to a minimum, so you don't have too much vegetative growth and consequently knock down your cannabinoid concentration. So it's a balancing act of like making it go lean, but not make it go hungry. That's my theory, but like I said, I don't have the data. So that's my theory. So you can have yours too. So when you're looking at nitrogen, just making sure the available levels are there. If you're paying for the nitrogen, there's no reason to do excessive leaching or clear water irrigation. Just slow it down. And I 150 works pretty well for nitrogen, and then lower rates at the end of the cycle when it's not using as much. If you measure the EC in the soil, if it's going up at the end, that means it's not being utilized by the plant. And so if you stable is what you adding is it's keeping it there, but you actually might want it to go down a little bit. We're not talking about going to zero in the soil, because there's no nutrient holding capacity, or very limited in a soil as substrate. And so you'll get deficiencies on most elements of nitrogen and phosphorus within 3 weeks. And I'm talking severe, as you can see in that earlier photo. And so, if you're running low during production, give it a single dose of 300 part per million. Works wonders of restoring the nutritional level. Phosphorus, we've done a lot of work with, specifically with floriculture crops. Josh Henry did his master's project on that. We typically see purpling when it's cold, but we also then see more necrosis really on warm season growing plants. But these symptoms also, especially the purpling, can happen cold weather, root rot, overwatering, just like nitrogen problems. Some of the initial work that we did looking at impact of phosphorus from low levels up to higher levels, we really found that things right around 10 part per million cut out. I mean, there's it under 7.5 was too low. You see the smaller plants, lack of expansion that was going on. And then you started getting higher, increasing the rate of P did not have an effect on overall plant growth or the cannabinoids or terpenes in our study. I think our recommended ranges are a little lower than Dr. Bernstein's, but I think that it's very close, but it's a continuum. So we all do our own little points, and then that's kind of where it's at. But it's, that range, 20, 25 part per million phosphorus, in my opinion, should be pretty good. I think Dr. Bernstein was up to about 30 when she was looking at the we in some studies, we didn't do the cannabinoid determination. So she had the advantage of providing that key set of data that's really needed to look at the impact on quality. So you can see here, deficiency, smaller plants, yellowing going on with the plant. And this, I love this graphic that came out of Manitoba, but it was seed hemp. And you can look that they measured the growth of the plant and the phosphorus input that's going on. And you can see very clearly in this graphic that there's a point where it really is doing uptake, and then its translocation. So with phosphorus, most of the nutrient uptake's happening the initial part of plant growth, and then it moves around. So you can see that that's going on there. And so how the slide's set up for me see if I'll move that over so I can see better. The green arrow indicates that what the purple part's seed. Well, for cannabis, unless you're doing seed production, we're not pollinating and not getting seed. So we don't see that huge translocation of nutrients getting reallocated into the seed as the plant grows. But you do see that, so that doesn't actually occur with the plant. And so what we see instead is a very big accumulation at the beginning, and then movement back around the plant into the flower and other portions. So you need to preload the plant with nutrients early on, and it does not justify the need of having large amounts of phosphorus, because the plant's not taking it up the last part of the cycle, and it doesn't have the sink of the seeds for needing to do that. And so we looked in one of the Cannabis Business Times articles we wrote about it there, of two different philosophies that were being presented by companies for fertility. And you can see the extraordinarily high levels of phosphorus being provided by company A during bud sizing and flowering, and we're talking under 30 part per million that we said was optimal. Other than that, it wasn't necessary. So ideally, I'm all for preloading, because you saw from the previous graph that there was translocation going on. So the preload is good. You get it in there, it'll move it around, but then just level it off so that, 196 part per million P is too much. 84 is. For company B, 52 is double, and 96 is double. We're not growing seed-based cannabis. So the plant doesn't need it, so you don't need to waste your money in providing it for the crop. And then we did want to see how far up we could go, and we did do higher rates on a follow-up study on Bayox, and did not see any advantages of going up really above the 15 to 25 part per million levels. So for management, you can get a little more stretch if you have too much phosphorus, but do keep in mind that low temps, wet growing conditions, and root rot can also end up causing a problem. And then you can apply a single application. So I see that I'm going a little on the long side, so I'm going to get through the next few slides. We have seen magnesium problems here because we don't have magnesium in the water supply. This was our COVID project. This is what I finished up on when we were closing down for COVID. So we see that intervenochlorosis, the bottom of the foliage, followed by necrosis coming, and it's common where you don't have the magnesium. You'll also see, strangely, the type of purpling like you'd expect instead with the bronzing that you'd see with a phosphorus problem. We found between 50 and 75 part per million optimized growth, and that's magnesium rates. And I think it's similar rates that Dr. Bernstein found with what was going on. So, know if you're adding calcium or magnesium from your water supply. If not, a CalMag formula will work, or Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate will work along the way. A corrective application that we use all the time is 2 pounds per 100 gallons of water for a crop, and helps green things up. But the sulfur in the magnesium does that. And we published it at Murray State and also had a Cannabis Business Times. So in summary, we have looked at a number of nutrient disorders. We published it in the Applied Science article in 2019. That was Paul Coxon's work. And we also followed up with some other work of looking at initial leaf tissue analysis standards. Again, as a person that diagnoses problems, I got to have a basis. I got to have the data to compare it. And that's where we made some initial surveys of actively growing good looking plants. And we're actually revising that even further with some mega data analysis that we're doing, because luckily with working with the Department of Agriculture here, we have a data set of over 6,000 tissue samples that we can tap into to look at distribution curves. So the Cannabis Business Times also did have an article on that. I do want to thank, the people who support us for different companies. Without the support, we wouldn't be doing the research. And with that, I'll open up to questions, and there's the QR code that if you want to get to the website to look at those articles, you can download them, you can. So with that, I'll stop and open it up for questions.
My video is blocked. Can someone unblock it?
Excuse me now?
No, it's not you. Okay, great.
Okay.
First of all, Mr. Whipker, I want to thank you very much for a very interesting and enlightening presentation. And I want to thank you also for the introduction about the diagnosing in general. damages symptoms in plants at all, and in focusing on cannabis, which is something that's so important. Many times, when people look at the plants, they either tend to look at biotic or abiotic and forget that there is a need really to diagnose both. So this was very important, and I think it's something we should stress in every of our nutrient, applied talk or plant science talk, that we need to make sure that we are really dealing with nutrient issues. So that was very interesting and very good. And something else that I want to thank you, which is not often done, is that the importance that you put and that the importance that you put about looking at local quality of water, the type of base water that we're using before adding nutrition, because in indoor cultivation, many people will maybe be using reverse osmosis water, so it's uniform throughout, the growing season, and it's have contained very little of anything. But as we all know, it's not the case for all type of indoor cultivations, and it's definitely not the case for outdoor cultivation. And therefore, when we all give recommendations for what the fertilizers need to be, what you stressed is so important. First of all, look at what you have in your water before you add, because what matters the most is what the plants are seeing at the end and not what we put into our water. And before we go to the questions, I also want to think that I really appreciate very much on the same line, the fact that you talk about is look at what you have in your substrate, in your growing media, because this is the same as water. Some of your substrates may have huge amount of specific type of nutrients, and some of them may have lower amount of specific type of nutrients. So then this must have a great effect on what we add in. And I think that people sometimes have a very high-tech, cultivation setup, and even very good quality of water, a purification system, but they forget to check what's in their medium before, in the substrate, in the growing medium before it starts. So thank you again for presenting those 3 points, before starting to deal with what do we actually need to add to the plant. I think this is critical. Okay, and let's go to the question. We have a lot of questions. We'll see how many we can get. The first question is about the data that you showed for effect of EC on rooting of the clones. The girdling effect that you found in high EC substrates, do you happen to know if it's a nutrient-specific effect, or is it most likely an effect of the overall EC?
And so I'm clear, we're talking about the plant that had with the high EC, it fell over, correct?
Yes.
The substrate. Typically, well, typically in production, we just look at it as overall EC. But of course, I'd have to go back and match up which one it is. You would know which element was the biggest. It was, nitrogen will do that to you. So it's really a cumulative effect. And I would, some of those substrates were very high in nutrients all the way across the board, and it's hard to say which one it was. But primarily it was all fertilizer salts. It wasn't really a sodium or chloride effect, I would assume. Is there another question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I disappeared or you disappeared. There was a kind of
Okay.
It was either me or you. I have no idea.
Okay.
Another question is related, actually, two questions are related to the type of the substrate. So
Okay.
one question was that the substrate blends contain the same ingredients. I assume that the question relates to not to minerals, but to the actual consistency, whether organic matter or whatever. And I seem to recall that in one of your slides there was actually some data about it. So
for the consumer mixes, many of them are organic. They contain a high percentage, depending on the one, guano. all of them on the first test, except for one, were organic mixes. So most of them are peat-based. Some of them have bark. In the US, when you look at some of these suppliers, even though it's the same company, something on the West Coast might be blended differently than what's on the East Coast, mainly because the weight and the bulk, they cannot distribute it national wide because of freight costs. So it might be, as an illustration, it might be Douglas fir bark on the West Coast, and it might be pine bark on the East Coast, because that's what you have. So there's differences even within a company. So all of the blends were unique, and none of them were the same. They were grown because that's just to compare the retail mixes.
That's interesting. The next question also can be related to the type of the substrate. It's about pH. The question is about responses to pH. Do you think that we expect similar responses of the plant in various types of growing media? The question is because nutrient absorbance to the media may differ between substrates.
For the mixes that we're using in commercial production, they pretty well don't have a lot of tie-up. That's one of the attributes they look for when it's being selected. Yes, you're going to get some, a core versus a bark versus a peat. But if you're growing outdoors where the plant has to actively go find the nutrients, I think the probability of having nutrient problems is higher. But in the greenhouse setting, we are giving luxurious amounts of nutrients every time we irrigate. So the plant just has to sit back and take it in. And so as long as you're above the threshold, even if there's a mild amount of tie-up, it's not going to be significant. And I think that's reinforced from the standpoint when you look at discontinuing fertility, that you quickly see within 3 weeks, you see obvious symptoms, but the symptoms have to have developed within a week or started to develop. There's no real holding capacity. Old-fashioned wise, they used to put in for floriculture like 5-10% field soil. That enabled you to get a little better buffering capacity. Micronutrients were supplied, and for the most part, when you added a field soil into the mix, you were able to grow at half a unit higher pH and not have any problems. That practice is expensive. It's a heavy mix. Topsoil is not being sold commercially in a mix because you'd be stripping the land. And then locally, it's not used very often, mainly because of herbicide residual problems from agricultural operations. So that's the long answer to say, I don't think they're, because we add so much fertility, I don't think it matters, because any small nuances are overshadowed by the quantity that you're adding on nutrition.
Yeah, that's I think the same thing, but it also means, which is what you're also stressing, that the response to pH is really response to pH of the irrigation of solution that we're giving. So it's a direct effect of the plant to the pH, and not a nutrient, not an indirect nutrient effect because of effect of pH on release from the medium or something, nutrients. So we are looking at more or less a direct pH effect on the plant.
Yeah,
It's hard to say.
Paul Nelson did some work a few years ago looking at what was a basic fertilizer when it was taken up by the plant, a basic reacting fertilizer, like a 15-5-15, a 13-2-13. In the US, there's a lot of custom blends that are being used, whereas an acidic mix is like 20-10-20, which has higher ammoniacal, urea, nitrogen. When you mix that fertilizer, it always comes out acidic. The chemical reaction of that fertilizer is acidic. The key that he found was that if you balanced the input of nutrients close to the requirements of the plants, then the uptake mechanism, anions and cations by the plant, help that basic or acidic reaction drive or help balance the pH in the root system by the plant. But the moment you added too much fertility, that reaction got overshadowed by the acidity of the fertilizer solution, no matter if it was going to be a basic reacting or an acidic reacting, because the basic reacting fertilizers actually had a lower pH when mixed than the acidic fertilizer. So there's yes and there's no. There's a balance act. If you measure the EC in the substrate, you know what the plant's taking up. If it's going up, you're adding too much. If it's going down, it's harvesting what's on there, and it's trying to get that levelness in there, and you would then be able to manage the pH with an acidic or basic fertilizer.
Thank you for this question and for this explanation. And the next question falls again within this pH issue that we seem to go into deeply into, and that is a question about hydroponics. What pH would be best for hydroponic growth? So now we are taking away the substrates altogether, and which ranges are we expecting for hydroponic growth? Do we have any information about this?
While I haven't done, we're growing in substrates. We're not growing, well, other than nutrient deficiencies, we're growing in sand, and so it's hydroponics. The sand just holding the plant up. We're targeting around 6.2. So I think universally, that 5.8 to 6.2, that's what I target with the hydroponic system. You really have to watch yourself with swings either way, too high or too low. You don't have any buffering. I mean, you have a little with the substrate, but you have nothing with the hydroponic system. So you have to dial it in. And so, if you want to pick one number, it's 6, and then you're balancing things out.
Thank you. The next question is, have you noticed any deficiency or disorder be more prone to causing hermaphrodism in cannabis?
Say the last part of that sentence again.
Do we know of any deficiency or possibly toxicity that affected the plants becoming hermaphrodites in cannabis? I mean, if I would have to say, yeah.
I mean, silver thiosulfate. So you consider silver to be an essential element. I mean, the not that I'm aware of, but I'm not the expert in that. So don't take me as being definitive on that answer. Nutritionally wise, with doing all the inductions of deficiencies and growing different rates, we've never seen that happen. Other than when we induced it with silver thiosulfate, when one student did it on a side project. So
yeah,
so
I mean,
I don't think so, but I don't know. That's the answer I'm going to stick with.
Yeah, I mean, if someone would ask me this question, I would answer the same thing. And we've done also from deficiency to toxicity on some nutrients, and we haven't seen any effect in the range. And I also have to say that at the same point of time, in the same greenhouse and different cultivation room in the same greenhouse, there was someone that was doing breeding in cannabis, and he was panicking about the fact that our plants may, become hermaphrodites. And so we were looking, and we didn't see any effect. We haven't published it or hasn't measured it, but we haven't seen any extreme things either. So
well, this might be a new area of research for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. The next question is, are your nutrient concentration calculated for ambient CO2 or elevated CO2? And the question is because this might increase nutrient demand due to higher water use efficiency.
ambient. I mean, if you get more growth, you're going to have more demand. But we're running off ambient.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I have to say that I have been, my studies are also done in ambient, and I got this question also a couple times, and my thinking is exactly, what you were saying. If we have higher CO2, water uptake maybe increase because the plant is growing faster, but then, still the demand for concentration will be the same. Maybe the overall uptake of fertilizer will be faster, but this will be compensated by irrigating more because the soil will dry out faster, then we will have to irrigate more. But at least we don't have any records for having any shifts in specific nutrients. But this is again a topic that I don't think I don't know if any studies that evaluated it.
But if you look at, I think there's a buffer zone that's there. I mean, if you think about it, based on what work you did and the work that we did, that if you look at rate studies and you're higher than the plateau, the peak, in agriculture, you go about 10% higher, so you don't have a deficiency. And so that extra nutrient load, while it costs you a little money, gives you your insurance policy. And it should be adequate based on, I mean, how we're growing plants in the greenhouse. Otherwise, if it's soil based, you ought to be able to see a problem of the EC going down. And if it's nutritional, you ought to see the development of nitrogen deficiency on the lower foliage. So those are your two backstops that you could use to see if the theory is actually working, to confirm it. But I think with our overage of what we typically apply, especially if we don't dial down nutrition at the last 3 weeks of production, you're probably adding it anyway, so you're not going to run into problems. The key factor is probably the first half. All veg in the initial few weeks of reproduction is going to be your key factor. The teenage years, you need to give them good fertility. When you get older, you eat less. So just like a plant. So.
Right. Great. The next question is, can you please explain why Epsom Epsom salt, I guess, would be a better choice over CalMag to address magnesium issues?
I guess the question is as compared to magnesium nitrate, because why do we pick Epsom salts? Number one, it's probably goes back to cost factor for growers. Magnesium sulfate's readily available. If you're trying to green things up, both the magnesium and the sulfur are very beneficial to doing that, especially like floriculture crops. The sulfur is the unknown nutrient that typically has not been on labels. Part of the reason is because it had been a pollutant. I mean, I remember a 1955 book out of the UK talking about that they thought there was going to be an increase in sulfur deficiency because they were switching from coal locomotives to electrical locomotives or steam, or moving from steam. So it really gets down to cost. You could make the change with a magnitrate application also. I wouldn't go mag chloride because you don't need the chloride. So cost and ease, I guess it's what we use. Not that the other ones would work. I don't think I think there's, I don't know the numbers in my head, but I have a feeling that mag nitrate's about twice as expensive as mag sulfate. So that's kind of an answer, but I don't know. Hopefully that satisfies why the person was asking the question.
Another question is, do you think that it is easy to correct nutritional deficiencies in cannabis?
Depends on which ones they are.
Yeah. And
The macros, especially early on, yeah, you can make the change. I mean, looking at if you catch them early, most of the macros you can make the change and recover. But you're talking about the growth potential that if you're running 3 weeks of veg and you're running low fertility, you're going to have a stunted plant that should have been twice as big. So then when it branches out like low phosphorus, you don't get the branching. So your yield potential is always compromised. So can you reverse it and get a yield? Yes. Will you get the same yield? Probably not. By the time you see a deficiency, the problem happened 2 to 3 weeks prior. So it's going to take you 2 weeks to dig out. Now, what we've seen that when late season problems come in, you'll see some problems go up a little higher in the plant when it's reproductive, and those you don't change. It just isn't going to happen. So, but then when you look at a boron deficiency, you're affecting the growing tip, which affects the flower bud. So you're probably going to have a gross change of yield. You can turn, if it's only an environmentally induced problem along with calcium, you're probably only going to, my guess is, lose 20%. But if it's an ongoing actual nutrient disorder, the yield's going to plummet further. So you can make some recoveries, but I think you're going to take it on the yield factor that's there.
All right, I'm getting a lot of notes. This thing, we are going over time. We have to start cutting down. We are going, but this is so interesting. There's still so many questions. Let's take one more question. Do you have any thoughts on using sulfur as a vapor, I guess, for pest management? If so, do we have any information of what levels are safe to use before the plant health is at risk?
I'm going to answer that a reverse way. Sulfur vapor historically had been used extensively in rose production for botrytis control. I was told by my major professor that there was a big range in Indiana and it was steam. They would just put a paste of sulfur down on the steam pipes and then it would volatilize at night. So under a glass greenhouse, that works pretty well. I have seen 2 cases, including our greenhouse, that sulfur plus water equals sulfuric acid. So we got to replace the plastic a little early because it deteriorated. So the Dutch, talking to some Dutch growers a few years ago with some of the vapor units, your key for application, specifically for disease control, powdery mildew, is that you don't have to run it that long. You just have to have a coating on top of the leaf that covers the new growth. And so you might only have to do it for an hour every week to cover the plant material. Now, if you're an indoor grow facility, you tell me what that's going to do to your electronics. So I got bit a little on that. We did it in the sulfur article. I tried to pick my words on that carefully, but it works. But you have to look at regulations that are local. Some states will not, in the U.S., will not allow that. But you can get those sulfur burners from many of the greenhouse supply companies for about $150, and they work. It keeps off powdery mildew, and it also indication it controls some pests, but also will affect equally beneficials.
Right. Thank you so much for those so interesting answers and for being so patient with the very large number of questions that we still haven't been able to get to. It was very interesting. I'm very happy, that there was such a large interest in the topic, and your very important and interesting answers. And thank you very much. I want to remind you that the talk is also recorded and will be available on online probably in 2 days. And thank you again, Professor Whipker.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
All righty.
And have a great remaining of the day.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.